إن أوروبا الجديدة هي الشرق الأوسط.
What would you do if you were the heir to one of the greatest fortunes in human history? Would you spend your life traveling or partying? Or maybe try to give it all away to charity? Or maybe you'd start buying sports teams, even sports leagues, and building impossible megacities in the desert. This is Mohammed bin Salman. He's the king-in-waiting of Saudi Arabia. But despite not being king yet, he's already the most powerful man in the country. Since he was made crown prince in 2017, he's set about transforming Saudi Arabia and fundamentally altering the geopolitics of the Middle East. And as you'll see, he's just getting started. This is a story of political intrigue, set in a country where the megacities of the future vie for space with the holiest sites in Islam. And it's a story of how one hot-headed man with a vision is breaking all the rules to get what he wants. This is the story of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Until 2015, Mohammed bin Salman, who I'll also call MBS at some points in this video, was kind of like a typical millennial. He didn't have a job, played a lot of video games, and his family probably worried about him. Except his life was anything but typical. His family just so happened to rule Saudi Arabia with an iron fist. Yet, Mohammed wasn't exactly on the radar of other foreign diplomats. But that all changed January 23rd, 2015, because that's when MBS's uncle, King Abdullah, died.
There's new concern about the future of the Middle East this morning after the death of Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah, one of America's closest allies. His successor is promising no major policy changes.
The line of succession was clear. Abdullah's younger brother and MBS's father, Salman, was already crown prince. Every single one of Saudi Arabia's 7 kings hail from the same family, the Sauds. The family's patriarch, Abdulaziz bin Abdul Rahman Al Saud, better known as Ibn Saud, captured the city of Riyadh in a daring raid in early 1902. After 30 years of conflicts and conquests, including between the British and Ottoman empires, Saud established the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with Riyadh as its capital in 1932. The Saud dynasty is a central fact of life in Saudi Arabia. In fact, not only have all 7 kings come from the same family, but the 6 that came after Ibn Saud have all been his sons. Although he never had to worry about elections, he ascended to the throne at what was something of an awkward time for Saudi Arabia. The first half of the 2010s couldn't have really gone much worse. Starting in 2010, US President Barack Obama decided to pivot away from the Middle East and towards Asia as part of a strategic rebalancing toward a region that was likely to be the epicenter of the most important global affairs of the 21st century.
Economies of this region will benefit workers, consumers, and businesses in all our nations.
The move away from the Middle East was in many ways not a surprise. 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had drained the US of blood, treasure, and prestige. But it was still an uncomfortable change for the Saudis, who had historically relied upon the United States for their security concerns. Why was the US such a reliable ally and security guarantor for Saudi Arabia? In a word, oil. Ever since the Dammam well No. 7 started producing commercial quantities, the country has been built on the stuff. Today, Saudi Arabia is home to the biggest conventional oil reserves, the biggest producing oil field, the biggest oil processing facility, the biggest pipeline, the biggest loading platform, and for almost all of the Cold War, it was the world's largest producer and exporter. Unimaginable quantities of Saudi oil powering cars, jets, and factories help underpin the US's rise to superpower status after World War II. The flood of oil was so vast and its effects so profound that it made the US-Saudi alliance strong enough to survive the revelation that 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were Saudi Arabian. As for Saudi Arabia, the alliance with the United States helped it increase its power and influence at a time when many of the traditional powers, namely Egypt and Iran, were losing theirs. However, the US was about to make its own substantial geological discovery, one that would forever transform the calculus of this alliance. The discovery of a vast reserve of oil trapped in shale rock and the development of the technology necessary to extract it transformed the US into the world's largest producer. Energy self-sufficiency went from a pipe dream to a reality. And it raised an uncomfortable question. If the US didn't need oil, did it really need Saudi Arabia?
Either this is the first Arab revolution of the 21st century.
The outbreak of the Arab Spring uprisings across the Middle East was a shot across the bows of the Saudi royal family. Their grip on power was never under threat, but it was a sign that people were beginning to question the basic social contract of stability without democracy, which had long prevailed in many Arab countries. And then things got even worse.
Today, after 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not: a comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
President Obama's announcement of a nuclear deal with Iran was seen as a diplomatic coup by the technocratic international class. To them, any satisfaction that the Iranian regime would be prevented from obtaining nuclear weapons was offset by the knowledge that they were negotiating as equals with the United States. To say that Iran and Saudi Arabia aren't friends would be an understatement. The Saudi royal family subscribes to a puritanical form of Sunni Islam called Salafism, or otherwise known as Wahhabism, which stresses pure monotheistic worship. Iran's regime, on the other hand, practices Shia Islam. The rivalry between Sunni and Shia dates back to the Prophet Muhammad, and although there isn't time for a deep dive on the nuances, safe to say it's a big deal. The second reason that Saudi Arabia and Iran don't get along is energy. Not only are both countries major oil and gas exporters, but they also have different priorities. Saudi Arabia has bigger reserves and a smaller population. Historically, its rulers have been happy to take a long-term view of things and to prioritize price stability in the oil market, even if it meant lower profits in the short term. Iran, by contrast, wants oil prices to be as high as possible. Sanctions have crippled its economy and led to social unrest. So despite being members of the OPEC oil cartel with Saudi Arabia, the clerics that run Iran will often flout their policies in order to optimize for their local economy. Energy and religion are tied into the third and most important factor driving the Iran-Saudi Arabia rivalry: their ongoing struggle for regional supremacy. The two countries have been on the opposite side of nearly every conflict in the Middle East going back decades. Add in Saudi Arabia's alliance with the US and Iran's alliance with Russia, and you have something resembling a Cold War in the hot desert. So, in a nutshell, Saudi Arabia and King Salman were facing a huge set of challenges. One of King Salman's first acts was to name his seventh son, Mohammed, as the Minister of Defense. MBS wasn't even 30. By the geriatric standards of Saudi politics, he was a baby. And he had the impulsiveness of someone who hadn't yet come face to face with the messy realities of geopolitics. As he became Minister of Defense, a civil war in Yemen had escalated to the point where Houthi rebels had seized the capital city. The Houthis were sponsored by Iran, and the last thing Saudi Arabia wanted was an Iranian client state on its southern border. MBS moved quickly. He mobilized a coalition of mainly Gulf countries supported by the United States to bomb the Houthis, impose a naval blockade, and deploy ground forces into Yemen. He expected a quick win, but when it failed, he wasn't deterred from pursuing other foreign policy objectives. After Russia intervened in Syria's own bloody civil war in late 2015, MBS ensured that Saudi Arabia increased its support for the rebels fighting against Bashar al-Assad, including by supporting the creation of a Sunni Islamist coalition.
سوف تنشأ
غرفة عمليات.
There shall be an operations room in Riyadh for the coordination and support of efforts to fight terrorism in many parts of the Islamic world. This announcement comes from the Islamic world's vigilance, so it can be a partner as a group of countries in fighting this disease.
The aggressive escalation of both conflicts had major humanitarian implications. MBS's actions were being noticed, both by the country's rulers and its rivals. In January 2016, mobs stormed the Saudi embassy and consulate in Iran. They were responding to Saudi Arabia's mass execution earlier that day of 47 prisoners, including an influential Shia cleric who had called for free elections. Protesters chanted "Death to Assad," threw Molotov cocktails, and broke into the compound. By the time security forces dispersed the protesters, almost 100 people were dead. In response, Saudi Arabia broke off diplomatic relations with Iran.
Saudi Arabia saying it's cutting ties with Iran.
It marked a dangerous deterioration in what was already a tense relationship. But King Salman loved it. Where people saw his son's actions as clumsy and reckless, he saw them as bold and decisive. Despite being insulated from any kind of popular election, Saudi Arabian rulers understand the systematic challenges facing the kingdom. Like so much in Saudi Arabia, it boils down to oil. If the Saud dynasty is the central fact of political life in Saudi Arabia, then oil is the central fact of economic life. It has provided Saudi Arabia and the men who run it with unimaginable riches, while also enabling the country to punch well above its weight diplomatically. But at the same time, it has stunted the capacity of civil and state society. Oil accounts for 92% of the Saudi budget. It crowds out everything.
كأن دستورنا الكتاب والسنة ثم البترول. هذه خطيرة جدا. إحنا صار عندنا حالة إدمان نفطية.
So much money is lavished on native Saudi citizens in the form of tax breaks and subsidies that many don't even work at all, or those that do take cushy jobs, but they really don't have to do anything. And sometimes that boredom can metastasize into religious extremism. The country's bureaucracy and military are weak, and vast amounts of the country's productive work is done by millions of guest workers. Americans and Europeans are brought in to perform highly skilled work, while mid-skilled and unskilled labor is mainly done by people from South Asia, Africa, and the Philippines. For a glimpse of how distorted the Saudi economy is, consider this. The religious tourism industry employs about 1 million people and brings in about 17 million visitors annually. Disney World employs fewer than 70,000 people and brings in 55 million people a year. And while oil-induced distortions create enormous inefficiency, it's not the only reason that the regime needs to decrease its dependence on it. In late 2015, just months after MBS became defense minister, the world negotiated the most ambitious climate treaty ever, the Paris Agreement. The old Saudi economic model will eventually run out of steam. Enter Saudi Vision 2030.
تعتمد بحول الله اليوم استراتيجية صندوق الاستثمارات العامة 2021 إلى 2025 التي تمثل مرتكزا رئيسيا في تحقيق طموحات وطننا الغالي نحو النمو الاقتصادي ورفع جودة الحياة وتحقيق مفهوم التنمية الشاملة والمستدامة في مختلف القطاعات التقليدية والحديثة.
A bold plan to develop alternative revenue sources, boost investment, and increase the share of the economy generated by the private sector. It's an ambitious blueprint, years in the making, for changing the country. The gigantic state-owned oil firm Saudi Aramco would be partially privatized. Women would be allowed to drive and dress the same way as places like Dubai. Sports teams, even entire sports leagues, would be bought or created out of thin air. The country's notoriously strict interpretation of Islam would be moderated. Glittering megacities, the likes of which you'd only read about in science fiction, would sprout from the desert. Everything was in play. After all, money was no object. There were no voters demanding accountability. King Salman knew that inertia was a powerful force. The country's rulers had known for decades they'd need to find a future outside of oil, but they'd never managed to do it successfully. Now they needed to do it faster than ever. King Salman decided that the bold plan needed a bold leader. So the announcement of Saudi Vision 2030 in April of 2016 was accompanied by another announcement, Mohammed bin Salman would be responsible for its implementation.
فأعتقد أن هذه دافعين رئيسية لعمل رؤية 2030 لكي نزيل التحديات التي تواجهنا ولكي نستغل الفرص الغير مستغلة اللي قد تكون بحجم 90% من وضعنا اليوم ونستمر في النمو والازدهار وننافس على كل الجبهات في أنحاء العالم.
Overseeing Vision 2030 meant that MBS was in charge of his country's economic and social modernization. He was rapidly accumulating more power than almost anyone in government. The next year, he was named Crown Prince. MBS had escalated Saudi's role in 2 civil wars and taken control of a massive economic and social overhaul of his country without even being the king in waiting. King Salman had previously overlooked his son in favor of his nephew, Mohammed bin Nayef. But on June 21st, 2017, bin Nayef was deposed by royal decree. It wasn't exactly a smooth or voluntary transfer of power. The New York Times reported that bin Nayef was held against his will and pressured for hours to renounce his claim to the throne. To add insult to injury, his bank accounts were frozen and he was put under house arrest for over a month. An unnamed Saudi official called the story a complete fantasy worthy of Hollywood. Or perhaps King Salman's 7th son, who was already the deputy crown prince, was applying the same ultra-aggressive strategy to internal politics that he had taken to foreign affairs. Whatever the case may be, MBS was named crown prince. Less than 2.5 years after he was appointed defense minister, he was the king in waiting. Almost immediately, he teamed up with Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince of the United Arab Emirates, to manufacture a diplomatic crisis in neighboring Qatar. A coalition of countries, led by Saudi Arabia, severed diplomatic relations with the tiny emirate, citing their support for terrorism, interfering with the internal affairs of other countries, and of maintaining relations with Iran. Now, when it comes to funding terrorism and meddling in other countries' politics, Saudi Arabia was far from guilty, but that was not the point. MBS and bin Zayed simply wanted to install a more pliant regime into a country that was increasingly becoming a rival for foreign investment. But the newly crowned prince couldn't escape political pressures back home. The extensive royal family was shocked by the disruptive speed of change and dismayed by his misadventures abroad. The Yemen civil war, which MBS thought would be a quick win that would boost his and Saudi's prestige, had instead turned into a quagmire and humanitarian nightmare. Saudi Arabia's blockade led directly to a devastating famine. It's believed 50,000 Yemeni children died of starvation in 2017. And yet, the Houthi rebels were still in the capital. Bin Salman knew that failure in Yemen made his grip on power tenuous. After all, what was stopping his rivals from turning around and being just as aggressive as he had been? He had to act fast before he lost power entirely. On October 24th, acting in his capacity as the minister of the Vision 2030 plan, Mohammed bin Salman hosted an audience of princes, ministers, and businessmen at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. They were there for the announcement of NEOM, a $500 billion mega project that included a linear city. Lots of them lingered in or near the hotel in the following days to relax and network. That's when MBS made his move.
Call it a surprise Saturday night shakeup. Saudi state TV reported that 11 princes, 3 current and dozens of former ministers have been detained.
He ordered hotels management to stop taking new bookings and to kick out its guests. At the same time, he ordered the airport to ground all private jets. He then detained as many as 500 people, including his rival, Prince Mutaib bin Abdullah, inside the Ritz-Carlton. MBS, in collaboration with Saudi banks, confiscated billions of dollars worth of their assets. Notionally, it was all about cracking down on corruption. But that word loses a lot of its meaning in a country where one family is unimaginably rich and rules everything. It was about power, who had it and who didn't. The threat was obvious. MBS had detained his rivals, and all he'd done was make them turn out their pockets. he could have done much worse. The audacious purge cemented his control over the Saudi security forces and therefore consolidated his own status as the most powerful person in Saudi Arabia. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Because although MBS had effectively sidelined his political rivals, he still had opponents, journalists, clerics, human rights advocates, and business people. In other words, people with the freedom to speak their mind. MBS knew they wouldn't stop criticizing him just because he asked nicely. So instead, he had them arrested in sweeping crackdowns. Some were let go, while others languished behind bars. The arrests didn't seem to dampen the West's enthusiasm for MBS. Donald Trump visited Riyadh on his first foreign trip as US president. Media profiles, ranging from curious to fawning, were written about MBS's reform agenda. He even visited Silicon Valley, where he met leaders like Cook and Sundar Pichai. Maybe it wasn't enthusiasm so much as hope. Hope that MBS could curb his more impulsive nature, institute some real, meaningful internal reforms, and help play a role in reducing the amount of conflict sweeping through the Middle East. One critic who was never convinced was the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. In his work, he portrayed a very different narrative than that put forth by MBS and his supporters. Khashoggi wrote about the arrests, the suppression, the executions, the need for reform. He did it so vehemently that he became afraid for his own safety.
Basically what I'm doing right now is just restructuring my life. I don't want to be a dissident, but in the same time, I don't want to go back home and be silent again.
So he went into a self-imposed exile in the United States, where he began writing for the Washington Post. But just because he left Saudi Arabia didn't mean his journalism did. If anything, Khashoggi's exile made MBS's problems worse. Now the regime's highest profile critic was writing freely in the US's biggest political newspaper. This would make it very hard to court additional support from DC. But MBS knew Khashoggi's weak point. He was about to get married to his Turkish fiancée. Khashoggi was desperate to complete all the paperwork at the Saudi embassy in Washington. But he was told that some of the paperwork could only be filled out in Istanbul. His first visit to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, which he made unannounced in late September 2018, was uneventful. Embassy officials told him to come back on October 2nd. Before the sun rose that morning, a 15-member group of Saudi security officials arrived from Riyadh on 2 private Gulfstream jets. CCTV showed that the men entered the consulate at about noon. Khashoggi arrived an hour later, accompanied by his fiancée. He entered the consulate, but he never came out. It took some time for the truth to emerge. For 18 days, Saudi Arabian officials denied Khashoggi had even died in the consulate. But the Turkish government had secretly bugged it, and they had footage of his final moments.
Jamal Khashoggi'nin üzerine yani gerçekten boğuluyorum diyor. Bırakın diyor. Nefes alamıyorum diyor. Ama maalesef cellatları orada o 5 dakika içinde canını aldı.
As soon as he entered the consulate, the 15-man team tortured and strangled Khashoggi in a back room, hacked his body to pieces using a bone saw, and smuggled his remains to the consul general's house, where they were cremated in a barbecue pit. By November of the following year, the CIA had concluded that Mohammed bin Salman had personally ordered the operation. Following the assassination, several other exiled Saudi activists reported that the regime had tried to lure them into their embassies across the world. An unnamed source with knowledge of Saudi intelligence operations said that the murder was part of a broader effort to silence critics of the Saudi regime. The barbaric assassination of Jamal Khashoggi was a major turning point for Saudi Arabia's relations with the world. Western leaders, diplomats, and journalists responded with horror. In the United States, the assassination reinforced the misgivings that the foreign affairs and human rights communities had harbored for years about the precise value of the US-Saudi alliance. The The European Union and individual EU member states were outraged.
That the killing of Jamal Khashoggi is still making the news. That needs to continue, because that's what is going to annoy the hell out of them and be the mosquito in the tent that they can't ever get rid of.
For one thing, the Saudi government tried desperately to deny the allegations. More importantly, what the Saudi government did afterwards to try to launder its image in the eyes of the West. As part of the Vision 2030 strategy, the Saudi government, with its massive sovereign wealth fund, is investing billions of dollars to transform the world of elite sport. They've bought an English Premier League soccer team, invented a rival golf tour which lured away some of the world's best players from the PGA Tour, created a Saudi Arabian Formula One Grand Prix, signed Cristiano Ronaldo as a player to the Saudi Pro League, signed Lionel Messi as a tourism ambassador, and made a $1.1 billion offer for Kylian Mbappe. And that's just the greatest hits. When asked why Saudi Arabia is spending all this money on sport, Mohammed bin Salman says it's about increasing tourism revenue. But that explanation doesn't really make much sense. How does buying a soccer club from northeastern England increase Saudi Arabian tourism? And frankly, even though some of the deals look like great business, they're relatively small by Saudi standards. The real reason that Saudi Arabia is pouring money into sports is that MBS can use it to portray his kingdom as a modern, forward-looking place. Critics have another term for it: sports washing. They say it's a smokescreen to cultivate positive sentiment towards the Saudi regime while also distracting them from the human rights abuses. But Saudi Arabia's investments are mostly intended for Western audiences. Because closer to home, back in the Middle East, the reaction to the Khashoggi murder was much more muted. For most people in the region, the assassination didn't teach them anything new about MBS. It simply underlined the point that had already been made by his interventions in Yemen, Syria, his manufactured diplomatic crisis in Qatar. He was reckless. But there's two countries that we haven't really mentioned yet. They're not in the Middle East, they're not in the West, they don't care so much about human rights abuses either. And they saw the opportunity in MBS's ascent to gain their own geopolitical advantage. Of course, I'm talking about Russia and China. Let's start with Russia. Their relations had been strained with Saudi Arabia for decades. Russia remembered the Saudis' support for the Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan War, while Saudi Arabia was wary of Russia's alliance with Iran. And the two countries were on opposite sides in Syria's civil war. But sometimes, individual events reveal close mutual interests. In the aftermath of the Khashoggi assassination, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that basically it wasn't worth worrying about because Russia didn't know what really happened.
Here we're saying that there was a murder committed in Istanbul, but no steps were taken. There should be a unified approach to the problems of such kind.
His press secretary later clarified that there was no reason not to believe the official Saudi version of what happened. This wasn't the first time that Putin had done MBS a diplomatic favor either. He abstained from criticizing the Saudi-led intervention into Yemen. And beyond cordial diplomacy, the two leaders had already begun working together for more than 2 years. In September 2016, they met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in China to discuss cooperating to reduce oil output and drive up prices. At first, the cooperation was only planned to last for the first half of 2017, but the two nations quickly agreed to extend them. It hasn't always been smooth sailing. There was a brief oil war between the two countries back in 2020, but safe to say things are back on track. In 2021, at an arms expo outside Moscow, Saudi Arabia and Russia signed a military cooperation agreement. Let's move to China. China has been Saudi Arabia's largest economic partner since 2014 as the #1 source of Chinese oil. But relations have gone to the next level since MBS became crown prince. For one thing, he has publicly supported China's policies in Xinjiang, where more than 1 million Muslim Uyghurs have been forced into detention and re-education camps under the guise of anti-terrorism. Shortly after that, the two countries embarked on talks to align Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 strategy with China's Belt and Road Initiative. As a result, trade between the two countries has increased in value by 70% between 2017 and 2021. In late 2022, during a state visit by Xi Jinping, China and Saudi Arabia announced they were elevating their relationship to the status of comprehensive strategic partnership.
إمكانيات للدفع بتلك الشراكة لمستويات أعلى تخدم مصالح مشتركة وتسهم في حفاظ السلم والأمن الدوليين، ونحن على ثقة أن النتائج الإيجابية لهذا اللقاء ستنعكس بشكل كبير جدا.
The highest level in China's formal ranking of relations with other countries. Look closer, and the mutual interests of Saudi Arabia with both Russia and China begin to reveal themselves. China needs a lot of energy to power its goal of overtaking the United States as the preeminent global power. And Xi doesn't care where that oil comes from. While Russia supports all efforts to increase its revenue through oil and gas exports, particularly after the invasion of Ukraine. As for Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman, he wants the trade and partnerships that can power his Vision 2030 into fruition. He wants arms both to protect Saudi Arabia from its regional rivals and to equip its proxies in foreign conflicts. And he wants to be taken seriously as a geopolitical actor. The strengthening of bilateral relations between Saudi Arabia with Russia and with China is a genuine success. But at the same time, those relationships have only really become possible because of the weakening of the relationship of Saudi Arabia with the United States. Trump was much friendlier to Saudi Arabia, so much so, in fact, that he made it his first foreign visit as president. Later in his presidency, he would go on to praise the Ritz-Carlton purge and cast doubt on whether bin Salman had been involved in the assassination of Khashoggi, despite contradicting evidence from the CIA. For Saudi Arabia, having Trump as president meant less irritating questions about human rights, more arms sales, and the abrupt end of the Iran nuclear deal. That naked pursuit of mutual self-interest suited Mohammed bin Salman just fine. For the first time in his rise to power, the West was treating him as a real negotiating partner, and they would be rewarded for it. 2 months before the 2020 election between Trump and Biden, a historic announcement would forever change the paradigm of Middle Eastern politics. In the first step of what soon became known as the Abraham Accords, Israel and the UAE, led by MBS's friend Mohammed bin Zayed, agreed to normalize diplomatic relations in exchange for Israel's suspending the annexation of the West Bank. This was a huge deal. The United Arab Emirates was just the third Arab country to normalize relations with Israel, following Egypt and Jordan. A month after the big announcement, Bahrain became the fourth. The Abraham Accords represented a fundamental shift in the political allegiances of the Middle East. They reflected three things in particular. The first was the victory of the concept that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. For obvious reasons, relations between Israel and Arab countries have been historically tense. But both Israel and Sunni Muslim countries had an even greater enemy in common: Iran. Normalizing relations was the first step towards coordinating a response to Iranian influence. The second was that it marked the biggest step yet in the gradual dwindling of Arab solidarity for the cause of Palestinian statehood. For basically the first time, Arab countries signed a document which recognized Israel's de facto annexation of the West Bank. They didn't call for settlements to be stopped, just paused. The third change in the region that the Abraham Accords captured, it's the reemergence of nationalist leaders and politics. Historically, and please know I am condensing a lot into just a few sentences here, Pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism has been a very strong ideological force in the region. This is the idea that all Arab peoples constitute a single nation. In 1958, Egypt and Syria actually joined to form an entirely new state. Arab nationalism gained popularity because newly formed states typically lacked a founding myth that tied their people together, because they shared a religion, and because they had the same enemies. But major events, such as the Arab coalition's defeat to Israel in the Six-Day War, frayed the consensus. Today, Pan-Arabism is essentially dead, or at least relegated to the sidelines. But it wasn't replaced by nationalism. It was replaced by sectarianism. No amount of effort, either by Saddam Hussein or the United States, could convince the majority of Iraqis to think of themselves as a single people with common interests. They weren't Iraqis. They were Sunni Iraqis or Shia Iraqis. Or consider the long-running proxy conflict between Iran, representing Shia Islam, and Saudi Arabia, the cradle of Sunni Islam. Mohammed bin Salman knew perfectly well that sectarian conflict weakens Arab countries. After all, that's why he intervened in Yemen and Syria. And he also knew that historically, it had been difficult to teach citizens of Arab nations, particularly ones outnumbered in their own country by guest workers, to think in terms of their national interests. And Mohammed bin Salman cannot be weak. He must expand his own power and the power of Saudi Arabia. He won't let journalists, political rivals, or tertiary regional powers stand in his way. He's a modernizer who wants to disrupt the politics of the Middle East. We know that much. But disrupt them how? Modernize to what ends? The answer to both of those questions is deceptively simple. MBS is a Saudi nationalist who thinks primarily in terms of Saudi interests. He's not indebted to ideas of the past like Pan-Arabism or Wahhabism. He's looking forward to 2030 and beyond, to a future where Saudi Arabia is stable, prosperous, and powerful. In July 2022, Joe Biden, who defeated Donald Trump to become US president, visited the Middle East. He visited America's closest ally in the region, Israel, and he headed to Riyadh to visit with MBS. That was a surprise to anyone who had watched Biden on his election campaign promise to make the Saudi regime pay for its assassination of Jamal Khashoggi.
And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are.
Except that's not what happened. The fist bump was widely perceived as Biden backing down from his campaign promise, even deferring to MBS.
Comments about Khashoggi.
He basically said that he was not personally responsible for it. I indicated I thought he was.
What changed? Russia's invasion of Ukraine jacked up global oil prices at the same time as making countries reluctant to accept Russian imports. Suddenly, the US, which needed oil for its NATO allies, needed Saudi Arabia to play nice. For MBS and Saudi Arabia, the fist bump was richly symbolic. The US president, 50 years older than the Crown Prince, traveled to Riyadh virtually cap in hand. It was humiliating for Biden and deeply satisfying for MBS. Don't get me wrong, Saudi Arabia still needs the United States. But events like the fist bump, or MBS snubbing Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, like he did when Blinken tried to persuade MBS to condemn Hamas's terror attacks in Israel, show us that the power dynamics of the relationship are rapidly changing in ways that looked totally implausible even a decade ago. Part of the reason why is Saudi Arabia's increasingly close relationship with Russia and China. Neither of those countries can provide the kingdom with the same guarantees of security against, say, an Iranian nuclear bomb, but they can help Saudi Arabia achieve the unexpected with creative diplomacy. In April of this year, the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers announced a plan to restore diplomatic relations, which had been severed after the attack on the Saudi embassy in Tehran. As if that wasn't surprising enough, they made the announcement in Beijing. The deal was brokered by China. All of a sudden, the impossible seemed possible in the Middle East. In his first ever English language interview with Fox News, Mohammed bin Salman indicated that Saudi Arabia and Israel are on the cusp of normalizing their diplomatic relations.
Every day we get closer. It seems it's for the first time real one, serious. We're gonna see how it goes.
Saudi Arabia won't be the first Arab country to normalize relations with Israel, but they could easily be the most significant. Why is MBS the architect of the disastrous war in Yemen, the man who fabricated a diplomatic crisis in Qatar, seemingly so intent on stabilizing relations with his country's main adversaries? The answer is that for MBS, the chaos of his early days was a ladder to get where he wanted. He used the interventions in foreign wars to establish his own political credentials and then purged his rivals for the throne. Now that his power at home is unchallenged, his relations with China and Russia are growing stronger, he's free to turn his attention to his true goal, turning Saudi Arabia into whatever he wants. In early October 2023, soccer's governing body, FIFA, announced that the 2030 World Cup would be shared by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, with additional games being played in South America. On the same day, they released guidelines for the 2034 tournament. Bids were confined to the Asia and Oceania regions. Saudi Arabia put in its bid just minutes after the process opened.
Previous 6 World Cup, so the chance to do so in 2034 on home soil and in front of our fans in Saudi Arabia will be incredible.
And unless King Salman can miraculously cling to health and power all the way to 2034, then it will likely be his nephew, Mohammed bin Salman, overseeing the tournament as king. One wonders how different Saudi Arabia will be by then. How many of the planned megacities will have been built? How diversified will the economy be? How free will its people be? Will the country be a stabilizing or destructive force in the region? Who will its main allies be? Increasingly, the answer to those questions will be decided by one man, Mohammed bin Salman. His rule is a reminder that when we talk about the changing world order, that change is often driven by individuals with vision and an insatiable thirst for power.